The wind off the high timber cut like a rasp. It hissed through the pines and rattled the loose bolts of an old trestle where the rails bent around a granite shoulder. The tracks were warped and brown with rust, but they still held the valley like a scar. Somewhere downriver a horn sounded. Not long, not far. Mason Cole did not waste breath on panic. His wrists were lashed behind him, ankles crossed and cinched, cheek pressed to splintered ties that smelled of tar and frost. He tasted blood. His left shoulder was out. He could feel the arm floating, useless and hot, while the rest of him went cold. To his right, Derek Vaughan lay quiet and deliberate as if measuring the ground with his ribs. On the other side, Luis Ortega kept fighting the cords until the skin at his wrists went slick. A strip of cloth bit hard across each of their mouths. Speak with your eyes, Cole had taught them years ago. So they did. Mason sent one look to Luis. Breathe slow. Save strength. Luis blinked once. Copy. They were Marines by habit, even if the discharge papers said otherwise now. Nobody had papers for this. The dog came out of the cut bank without a sound. One heartbeat there was only brush and frost. The next heartbeat there was a German shepherd standing in the cinders. He was big across the chest and lean everywhere else, coat the color of wet stone. A white seam of old scar ran across one ear. He favored his right rear leg. He held his head low, but his eyes were not low at all. They burned with a purpose that did not belong to a stray. Mason felt the blink of disbelief, and then he pushed it away. The dog stepped to him, nostrils tasting the air over a ripped shirt and the metal taste of fear. He studied the knots, moved to the gag first, took the cloth in his teeth and worried it like a stubborn root. It came free with a wet snap. The sound that left Mason was more air than voice. Easy. Help them. He turned his cheek so the dog could read his eyes. Please. The dog shifted to the cords at Mason's wrists. He set his teeth and pulled. He did not thrash. He did not waste. He found the grain of the nylon and worried the one point that would loosen the hole. The far horn sounded again, closer. The rails under Mason's jaw began to hum. Luis made a strangled noise through his gag. Derek tensed. The dog's ears flicked back, then forward. He pulled harder. Mason felt the cord jump. Once more, the binding gave. The pain that followed when Mason rolled his shoulder back into the socket rode up and down the spine in a bright flash. He swallowed the shout and fought for his knees. The dog was already on Luis. His paws slid on frost, but the teeth went right to the knot. The headlamp showed now, pale against the bend. Derek's eyes never left the dog. The knot let go. Luis ripped his own gag free and sucked air that tasted like iron and winter. Move, Mason said. The word cracked out, thin but clear. On your side. Crawl. Derek lifted his head. Not without you. The dog darted to Derek, took the gag, and then the cord. The tremor in the rail turned to a low shake in the ties. The curve funneled sound until it was everything. Mason got one arm under Derek's chest and hauled. Luis pushed with his shoulder, boots sliding. The dog danced back to make space and then bolted up the ballast toward the tree line. Not that way. He stopped and turned tight, facing them, barking once. It was not panic. It was orders. There was no time to argue with a creature who looked like he had been giving orders his whole life. Mason followed him, dragging Derek. Luis stumbled behind, half upright. The dog raced past the alder thicket and cut left again toward a shallow gully that crossed under the rails. To eyes that were not searching, it was nothing but a sag in the earth and a tangle of culvert grass. To a nose that knew water and iron, it was a tunnel. Drop, Mason said. Now, he shoved Derek into the wet ditch and rolled after him. Luis slid in last, his heels scraping rust from the culvert rim. The dog launched over them, hit the far bank, and then twisted to wedge his body like a brace against Mason's back, pressing them all down into the stink of cold mud. The train hit the bend and the valley turned to thunder. The culvert shook. Gravel rattled like hail. A blast of diesel and hot metal poured through the grate and burned the eyes. The plow blade threw a sheet of icy mud through the gap and across their shoulders. For a second, the weight of the thing felt like it would push the earth down over them. Then the thunder moved on. The last car clattered by, and the air came back in pieces. Luis started to laugh, and then it choked out as a cough. Derek lay still with his eyes closed, one hand pressed against his ribs. Mason felt the dog's weight leave his back. He rolled to his knee. The shepherd stood at the mouth of the culvert, head just above the lip, scanning the lines. He did not look at the men first. He looked out into the trees. A new sound came that did not belong to trains. A light clack, small metal on metal. The dog's hackles lifted. Mason grabbed the culvert edge and pulled himself up enough to see over. Down the curve, two figures in dark parkas emerged from the timber and walked the ties slow, eyes on the ground. One carried a short rail trolley handle. The other had a light and a radio. They were not railroad. They moved like men used to weight belts and quiet exits. The one with the light reached the place where rope fibers clung to the rail. He knelt. He lifted a strip of cloth, the end Mason had spit out. He brought it to his nose and smiled. He tapped his ear with one finger. A comm unit flashed once. Mason could not hear the words, but he read the lips when the man spoke into the mic. Survived. He did not shout. He sounded pleased. He stood and let the strip of cloth fall. The men walked on toward the trestle and then back into trees as if they had collected what they came for. The dog did not growl. He watched until the brush settled. "We were bait," Derek said. The voice was calm and wrecked at the same time. Mason slid out of the culvert and got the others up. The dog held their eyes for a second. Then he moved to Mason's torn binding and picked up the slack of nylon with his teeth. He carried it to the alder shade and dropped it. He pawed once at the ground and nosed aside leaves until a scuffed metal thing showed in the dirt. A broken padlock, body stamped with a triangle inside a circle, old rust on one side and fresh scrape on the other. Luis stared. That on railroad gear anywhere around here. Mason crouched and took the lock. His palm came away with grit and the faintest smell of petroleum and antiseptic. Not a yard job, not kids. Someone careful, someone who cleaned where he worked and dirtied where he needed to. The dog lifted his muzzle. His ears tracked the wind like instruments. Then he looked at Mason the way a dog looks when he is asking without words. Follow. Mason heard his own rule click in behind the ringing in his ears. If your gut speaks, listen. If your teammate's gut speaks louder, follow, even if that teammate is on 4 legs. "You got a name, buddy," Mason said. The dog blinked slow. A scarred ear twitched. "Ranger," Luis said softly. "Fits him." The dog did not wag. He did not need the ceremony. He turned and moved into the timber on a line that had nothing to do with the beaten path and everything to do with scent. The men fell in behind him. Mason looked once over his shoulder at the curve where the train was already only a memory. The fresh gouges on the rail caught light that was not there a minute ago. By the time they reached cover deep enough that the track was a story and nothing more, Mason let the pain in his shoulder speak for a breath. He stripped a sleeve and bound it tight. Derek shifted his own weight until the ribs found a bearable angle. Luis checked the skin at his wrists and flexed his fingers. Ranger ranged ahead, then back, keeping them in the pocket of wind he chose. When he returned, he brought more than air with him. He carried a strip of stiff canvas, military grade, cut clean. Inside, rolled tight and wet from the culvert, lay a small steel pry bar and a pick that had been ground down to fit old locks. Not some teenager's tools, not the hardware store bundle, workmanlike, issued somewhere or stolen from someone who knew what he was doing. "How did he find that?" Luis asked. "Because somebody meant us to find it," Derek said. "Or meant to come back for it and ran out of time." Mason touched Ranger's flank. The muscle hummed like cable under skin. There was a tremor in the hind leg and the old hitch in his step, but the dog stood like a wall. "You saved 3 Marines," Mason said. "That is not nothing." Ranger's eyes did not soften. They steadied. He angled his head into the wind that came from higher ground and from something else too. It smelled like rubber and sweat and a memory, older than this valley. He started up the grade with that purpose in his bones, and for the first time since the gag ripped free, Mason felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief. Not yet. Only the knowledge that they were not alone and that the one who had chosen them had reasons that would make sense later. Behind them, the rails sang a last small note as they cooled. Ahead, the trees took up the sound and made it a whisper. Somewhere out of sight, the 2 men in parkas spoke into their radios and checked their watches. The clock that had almost ended the story had only started it. Ranger did not look back. He led. They followed. They kept moving until the rails were a rumor and the trees closed in like a chapel. By late afternoon, the light went pewter and the cold settled under their jackets. Ranger guided them to what looked like nothing from 20 feet out and everything from 10. A buckled ranger, lean-to with one intact wall, a half-roof, and an old stone hearth blackened by a century of storms. He trotted the perimeter first, nose working the seams, then circled once and lay down as if to say, "Here, for now." Mason got a whisper of flame going from lint scraped off a sock's heel and a flint he kept tucked behind his belt loop. Derek sank onto a crate with his hands folded on his ribs, breathing through the ache. Luis shook blood back into his fingers and tried to look anywhere but the empty tracks in his mind. Ranger vanished without drama. He went as if the woods opened a door for him, silent and quick. When he returned, his muzzle was dark and his breath steamed. He dropped a rabbit beside the fire the way a man sets down a tool he knows you need. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for praise. He watched the knife in Mason's hand the way he'd once watched date cord in someone else's. Luis swallowed. He hunted for us. Not just hunted. Chose, Derek said. They ate quietly, the meat hot and a little bitter and perfect because it meant more cold could be held at bay. Ranger didn't take the first bite. He sat with his chest toward the doorway and his eyes on the dark, and only when Mason nudged a piece toward him did he accept. Even then he took his time, holding the food with his front paws the way dogs who've spent years outdoors learn to do when nothing is guaranteed. "He has training," Luis said finally. "He has a past," Mason answered. Ranger lifted his head like he'd heard his name spoken in a language only he remembered. He had belonged to Emily Cross before he belonged to no one. In the long years since, the memories came to him the way scent comes on a wind shift. Sudden, total, unarguable. On a hot afternoon in Kandahar, there had been a courtyard, a pot of mint boiling, and women's voices behind a sheet. Emily's hand had rested lightly on his neck while she breathed in time with him, slowing both their hearts before the sweep. On the lip of a culvert that day, just like this day, but with sun instead of frost. She had whispered the words she only used when she needed him to think and not just act. "Easy, kid." The phrase ran through him now and settled. His ear twitched. He stood and moved to the door, pressed his nose into the seam where wind became message. The scent of diesel had thinned, but something else remained. Shoes that were not hiking boots. Oil that was not chain oil. He filed it the way he had been taught and returned to the room. "You ever meet Cross?" Derek asked quietly, watching Mason watch the dog. Mason turned the flint in his fingers. Once. Twice. "I saw her work a range lane at Pendleton. She taught the handlers how to let the dog lead without making it look like the handler wasn't in charge. She had this way of..." He searched for words that could hold something that was mostly silence, of getting out of her own way. Luis looked at Ranger again as if the name had unlocked a door in his head too. You think this is her dog? I think we're alive because someone trained him like she did, Mason said. Ranger's gaze slid to Mason's right hand. Mason kept the palm open, fingers low, elbow in. It wasn't a command so much as a question. The dog moved closer, slow and deliberate, and Mason saw the scar he hadn't let himself name in the chaos at the tracks, a neat notch missing from the top of the left ear. Emily used to joke that Ranger had taken a chunk out of Helmand itself when a door slammed on him his first week in country. She called it his proof of purchase. That twist of memory landed with a weight that emptied Mason's lungs. He didn't say anything. He reached up and touched the healthy instead, a quiet offering. Ranger didn't flinch. He leaned a fraction of an inch into the contact and then stepped back, mind moving again. From the dark came a twig pop that wasn't wind. Ranger's head snapped to the door. Mason had his pistol up without looking. Derek pivoted, pivot cage still for a man with ribs like glass. Luis cut the flame with his palm and they let the trailed smoke write them smaller. A shadow passed and paused. The breath of it reached the doorway and tasted like wintergreen and oiled canvas. Ranger went forward on his toes, not a sound. He exhaled a single huff. The shadow moved on. The three men didn't speak until the cold reclaimed the gap. They know we're breathing, Derek said. They knew before the train, Luis added. Mason's jaw worked. Bait. The word sat in the room like one more body. Ranger left again, quick and low, and came back dragging something that clicked against the floorboards. He set down a canvas pouch stamped with letters, scoured almost to ghosts. 31st Engineer Detachment. The buckle was corroded, but inside someone had cared for the contents, a map case folded tight and a laminated card turned so the ink wouldn't fade. The map was local topo with one spur traced by a different hand in pencil. The card was one the Marines use for brevity codes. But the handwriting on the bottom, line, the little flourish on the C and the cross in the E, Mason would have known anywhere. Cross. E. For a second, the room went thinner. Mason felt the old camp dust under his boots and heard Emily laughing at some private joke with a corpsman he couldn't now name. She used to tuck cards like that where people who needed them would find them. She trusted found things. She liked the idea that care could travel without a sender. You knew her, Derek said bluntly. Not just the lane. Mason nodded once. She pulled me off a bad road with a look. Told me I was making the route about me and not about the ground. Saved 3 of us with that look. Luis's eyes were bright with the kind of anger that protects softer things. Then this is him. Ranger didn't understand the words, but he understood the temperature when a room turned from wary to decided. He lay down with his chest facing the door again, but his head was canted toward Mason now, as if keeping 2 perimeters at once. The twist came quiet and sharp. Luis had the map at an angle when the firelight slid under the top layer and showed what laminate was hiding. He peeled the corner back with a thumbnail and a strip of thin film lifted. Underneath, faint pencil script ran like a whisper along the margin. If I can't bring him home, let him choose one. Mason read it twice because reading it once felt like theft. The handwriting was hers. The smudge at the end was the way she always pushed too hard on the last word. He didn't show it like a holy thing. He folded the map shut with care, put it back in the pouch, and set the pouch where Ranger could see him set it. Choice matters, Mason said softly. Half to the dog, half to the woman who was no longer anywhere these men could reach. Ranger stood and came to him. He sat close enough that Mason could feel heat through his torn sleeve. Mason didn't reach first. He let the dog press the crown of his head lightly into Mason's sternum, a contact as brief as a signature and twice as binding. You stay as long as you want, Mason said. No leash. No orders that make no sense. You lead when you know. I'll say no when I have to. That's the deal. Ranger breathed out. His shoulders lost a notch of tension. Outside, the cold lifted, just a touch, as if the air itself had exhaled. Derek lay back and closed his eyes. Wake me if I snore. I want to be embarrassed to be alive. Luis grinned once, thin and real, like he'd let you sleep through your own noise. Mason let the banter curl around the edges of the room. He rolled his bad shoulder against the wall until the pain found a box it could live in, then he eased down the way men do when they mean to stay alert and still give bones a moment. Ranger didn't sleep. He dozed in the way of dogs who have learned that comfort is always negotiable. Every small sound ran across the fine bones of his ears. The fire sank to red lines. When the ember cracked, he flicked an air and settled his chin on his paws again. His dreams, when they came, were not of open fields. They were of buildings with heat baked into concrete and of a hand on his neck teaching him that thinking fast and moving slow was a kind of courage. Near dawn, a low drone threaded the trees, too thin for a helicopter, too steady for wind. Mason's eyes opened to it. Ranger was already up, staring into a seam of pale light that meant the sky was deciding to return. The drone faded. The quiet afterward wasn't peace. It was the kind of pause that comes when one player waits for the other to tip their hand. They broke camp without leaving a question behind. Luis scattered cold ash with his boot. Derek tucked the canvas pouch under his jacket. Mason stepped outside and faced the line Ranger had chosen. He lifted his hand just slightly, palm down. Ranger leaned forward and then back, a small check-in. "You with us, Ranger?" Mason asked. The dog didn't wag. He put one paw forward, then the other, and took the narrow trail that bent along the contour toward higher ground. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already made his choice. They followed him into a morning the color of old tin, 3 men and the dog who had changed the math on a rusted curve. Behind them, the rails cooled to dull red and forgot their names. Ahead, the timber held what they needed next. Ranger moved with the limp of an old fight and the focus of a new one. His past walked beside him without dragging him down. The first connection had been made, not with treats or praise, but with a thing truer in men and dogs alike. Purpose. The cold had teeth that morning. It slid under collars, gnawed at fingers, and turned every exhale into a cloud that hung just long enough to make the men think of smoke. They had been moving for hours, away from the lean-to and the thin cover it offered, choosing instead to stay mobile. Mason knew the danger in stillness. It gave your enemy a place to find you. Derek's ribs complained at every step, Luis's wrists were raw, and Mason's shoulder throbbed like a live wire, but they didn't talk about any of that. Ranger set the pace, never frantic, never wandering. He moved like the land whispered to him, and only he could hear. The trail wound through stands of lodgepole pine and over ground laced with frost-hardened moss. Ranger stopped suddenly, his whole body going rigid. His ears rotated toward something unseen, and his nose twitched, sampling the air in short bursts. Mason raised a fist, and the men halted, rifles, or what little they had left, half ready. Ranger turned off the faint deer track they'd been following and padded up a rise covered in granite slabs. The others followed, boots crunching on ice crystals that snapped like glass. At the crest, a wall of stone faced east, worn by centuries of wind and snow. Mason almost walked past the markings, shallow, weathered scratches, but Ranger planted himself in front of them and looked back, eyes intent. Luis squatted, running a glove over the grooves. They weren't random. The triangle inside a circle was deliberate, cut deep enough to outlast the season, maybe the decade. "Seen it before," Mason said quietly. "Where?" Derek's voice was low, but his eyes were already narrowing. On a stash house wall in Helmand province, it wasn't about drugs, it was about people, moving them like contraband, weapons, secrets, you name it. Luis stepped back, gaze flicking between the carving and the trees around them. So whoever marked this, they're claiming territory. Or warning those who don't belong, Mason said. Ranger had moved a few paces away, nose to the ground, tail stiff. He pawed at a patch of frozen duff beneath a root lip, then gripped something in his teeth and pulled. A rolled sheet of waterproof paper came free, its edges stiff and cold. Mason took it, unrolled it, and flattened it against a granite face. It was a topographic map of the surrounding region. Their original recon route was marked in bold red grease pencil, but there was more, an extension drawn in a fainter, hurried hand, stretching east beyond the area they'd been ordered to sweep. The endpoint was a cluster of contour lines where no official trail ran. Mason's gut clenched. In the bottom corner, a jagged tear cut away part of the map. "That's not weather damage," Derek said. "That's surgical." On the reverse, in cramped block letters, someone had scrawled, "No entry without the mark." The forest felt smaller for a moment, like the trees had leaned in to listen. Ranger gave a sharp exhale through his nose and trotted a few yards uphill. He stopped, looked over his shoulder, and waited. Mason had seen that posture in other dogs, other times. A point man's stance, wordless but clear. "Follow me." They climbed another ridge, this one steeper, the ground breaking into chunks of shale. Ranger paused at a split boulder and began sniffing the base. Mason came closer and saw it, a faint boot print in the dirt, sharp edges still intact. Recent. Too recent for comfort. Beside it, drag marks curved toward the far side of the ridge. "They've moved something heavy through here," Derek said, voice flat. "Or someone." Luis scanned the slope below. "Could be our missing link." The wind shifted. Ranger's head came up instantly, eyes locking on a patch of shadow under the trees. Mason followed his gaze, saw nothing at first. Then a flicker of movement. Just a branch, maybe. Or maybe not. They dropped low. Mason pulled the men in close. "We're not alone." A sound broke the air, a crow's harsh call. It came from too far east to be coincidence. Ranger's gaze stayed pinned on that direction, his breathing shallow but steady. Then, without waiting for a command, he moved, taking them downslope in a zigzag that kept them in broken cover. Mason trusted him without asking why. The dog led them to a half-buried rock outcrop. Behind a tangle of deadfall was a narrow shelf, just enough space to lie flat and look out over the valley below. Through the gaps, Mason saw a pair of figures, both in dark parkas like the men on the tracks, moving along a faint game trail. One carried a compact rifle, the other a pack bulky enough to hide something more than gear. They paused at the base of the ridge and dropped the pack. One man pulled out a small metal canister and set it on the ground. The other kept watch, scanning the woods, his gaze passing over their position without stopping. "Recon drop," Derek murmured. Luis's jaw tightened. "Or holding cell resupply." Below, the men finished their task, shouldered the pack and headed east, the same direction marked on the altered map. When they were gone, Ranger shifted, muscles tense, watching until the last flicker of movement was gone. Then he looked to Mason again. "We can't go back," Mason said. "This isn't a detour. It's the route they wanted us to find." Luis frowned. "And why would they want that?" "That's the part I don't like," Mason replied. Ranger stepped forward, placing one paw exactly on the torn edge of the map as if to pin the thought in place. The gesture was almost human. Mason didn't believe in omens, but he believed in the way a good dog could cut through noise. Whatever was east, Ranger knew it mattered. And Mason knew better than to ignore the one member of their team who hadn't made a wrong call all day. They packed up and moved out, following the line Ranger chose. The pines closed behind them, erasing any sign they'd been there. Somewhere in the east, beyond the reach of the cold wind, the map's unfinished trail waited, along with the kind of answers that didn't come without a cost. The wind shifted cold and sharp, curling down from the ridge like it carried news from a place they didn't want to reach yet. Mason stood over the map Luis had rolled out across a slab of granite, his finger tracing the pencil line that stretched east past their assigned patrol zone. The ridge behind them was the last easy path back toward base. A safe retreat, a return to protocol. But that was the thing about protocol. It didn't explain why 3 Marines had been left trussed on an abandoned rail line or why an old K9 was leading them like he knew the chapter ahead. "We head back now. We're blind," Mason said, keeping his voice low but firm. "We take this route. Maybe we get answers." Derek's jaw flexed. "Or maybe we walk straight into the hands of whoever tied us to that track." "They already know we're breathing," Mason replied. "That makes staying put the bigger risk." Luis looked down at Ranger. The dog was standing at the far edge of the granite, nose in the wind, ears shifting like radar dishes. "Looks like he's already voted," Luis said. Ranger stepped away from the stone and started down a slope littered with frost-hardened leaves. Mason slung his rifle and followed. Derek cursed under his breath but fell in behind, Luis closing the line. The trail bent through a thicket and spilled into a narrow ravine. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that comes from underground. Ranger slowed, angled left toward a mound of earth buttressed by old timbers. A rusted iron hatch lay half buried under pine needles, its hinges crusted with age. Mason knelt, brushing away debris. "This wasn't built for food storage," he murmured. The steel was thick, reinforced, meant to hold more than potatoes in jars. He put his shoulder to the hatch, and it groaned open, releasing a breath of stale, metallic air. Inside, a staircase dropped steep into shadow. Ranger took it without hesitation, paws clicking on the steps. Mason followed, the beam of his flashlight slicing through dust. Derek and Luis came next, boots ringing on the iron. The stairway opened into a chamber about the size of a 2-car garage. Concrete walls, a low ceiling, bare bulbs strung along a wire. Most were dead, a few sputtered. Along one wall, chains were bolted into the floor. An overturned cot lay in the corner, its mattress ripped and stained. Luis's breath steamed in the beam of his light. "This is a holding cell." Ranger padded toward a pile of burlap sacks. Sniffing hard, he nosed one aside to reveal scratch marks gouged into the concrete, short, vertical lines grouped in 5s. Days counted by someone who'd run out of other ways to measure time. Mason moved toward the far wall, his light catching on something tucked under a scrap of tarp. A journal, its leather cover worn soft. He flipped it open. Page after page filled with names, each written in cramped capitals. At the bottom of one page, a fresh entry, the ink darker. Mariah Rivera. Luis stiffened. "That's a local name. She disappeared 3 months ago." Mason turned another page. The last lines were smeared with something rusty brown. He didn't need to guess what it was. He was about to speak when Ranger froze, head snapping toward the stairwell. A low, throbbing hum began to pulse through the floor. "Get back!" Mason barked. The explosion wasn't fire so much as force, an invisible fist slamming the walls. The stairwell collapsed in a choking cloud of dust and grit. The single working bulb swung wildly, throwing broken shadows. Chunks of ceiling fell, the air turning unbreathable. "We're sealed in!" Derek shouted over the ringing in their ears. Ranger was already moving, nose sweeping the walls in fast, deliberate arcs. He stopped at a seam barely visible in the concrete, paws scrabbling at it. Mason joined him, running his hands along the surface until his fingers found the cold edge of a corroded latch. "Help me," he said, planting his feet. Derek and Luis got their hands on it, all 3 heaving until the latch gave with a scream of metal. A narrow shaft yawned open, barely wide enough for 1 man at a time. The air that came through was bitter but clean. Ranger slipped in first, vanishing into the dark. Mason went next, shoulders scraping stone, the weight of the earth pressing in. Derek and Luis followed, the passage forcing them into a crouch until at last the ceiling lifted. They spilled out into forest, nearly 200 yards from where they'd entered. Mason stood, sucking in the sharp air, scanning the trees. No voices, no movement, just the slow thump of his own pulse, and the dog standing 10 yards ahead, looking back at them with eyes that said plainly, "Not luck." "They knew we were coming," Derek said, voice low. "And they didn't want us leaving the way we came," Luis added. Mason nodded once. The air smelled of cordite and cold pine. This wasn't chance. They had been herded, step by step, into a trap designed to test, not to kill outright. And the thought that someone, somewhere, was keeping score made the back of his neck tighten. Ranger turned east, toward the part of the map drawn in that fainter, hurried hand. His body was taut, ears high, tail a straight line. Mason didn't call him back. The dog had just pulled them out of a grave someone else had dug. If Ranger was still leading, Mason was still following. They fell in behind him, moving deeper into the forest. The hatch behind them lay hidden under bramble and frost, sealing the passage they'd barely escaped. It would sit there, waiting for someone else to find it. Maybe that was the point all along. The air in the new tunnel was different, less stale but heavier, as if something still alive breathed somewhere ahead. The narrow passage opened into a cross-cut chamber shored with rotting timbers, old mining supports that looked ready to fold at a hard glance. Water dripped from unseen cracks in the rock, the sound echoing down both directions. Ranger stopped in the junction and lifted his head, nostrils flaring, then swung left without hesitation. Mason didn't question it. He motioned for Derek and Luis to keep low. The corridor narrowed, forcing them single file. A faint, flickering glow appeared ahead, warm against the gray of the stone. As they drew closer, the glow resolved into two stubby candles guttering behind a half-closed iron grate. Beyond the bars, two figures emerged from the shadows, one slumped motionless on a cot, the other standing unsteadily, hands gripping the bars. Luis froze mid-step. His breath caught, turned to something between a whisper and a choke. "Sophia." The woman's face lifted at the sound, and even in the dim light, there was no mistaking the resemblance. Sophia Ortega, thinner than Luis remembered, hair tangled, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, managed a trembling nod. I thought you were gone." Luis was at the gate in 2 strides, his hands wrapping around the cold iron. "We're getting you out. Right now." Mason was already scanning the lock, a heavy, old-fashioned padlock reinforced with a short chain. Bolt cutters would make short work of it, but they had none. He checked the hinges. Rusted, but still solid. They needed a key or a tool. Ranger had been standing still, head tilted slightly as if listening to a private conversation in the walls. Now he moved, no warning, just a decisive turn down a side corridor. Mason glanced at Luis. "Stay with her. Keep her talking." He and Derek followed the dog. The side passage smelled of oil and old leather. Ranger's paws splashed through shallow puddles without slowing. He stopped at a collapsed crate, nosed aside a broken board, and dragged out a small canvas tool roll. He gripped it in his teeth and trotted back toward the grate. Luis looked up as they returned. Ranger dropped the bundle at Mason's boots. Inside were half-rusted wrenches, a screwdriver, and, miraculously, a ring of keys. Mason flipped through them, testing one after another. On the 3rd try, the lock clicked. The gate swung open with a screech. Sophia stumbled into her brother's arms, clinging to him like he might vanish if she let go. Behind her, the woman from the cot stirred and sat up. Mid-30s, pale, with cropped blonde hair plastered to her head and green eyes that missed nothing. She pushed herself upright with effort. "Claire Jensen," she said, voice rough. You're not with them." "Not even close," Mason said. "How long?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. Hard to tell in here. They moved the others last night. Said there was a breach. Took everyone, everything. We were too weak to walk, so they left us." Louise frowned. "Why leave anyone?" Claire's smile was bitter. "Insurance or bait?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Who runs this?" Claire's gaze sharpened. "Name won't mean much unless you've been in the wrong rooms." "Caleb Knox. Doesn't talk on radios, doesn't show up in photos, but he gives the orders." The name landed like a weight. Mason had heard it before, whispered in a briefing years ago, attached to operations that didn't officially exist. The kind of man whose reach extended far beyond the shadows he worked in. Footsteps scraped somewhere back toward the junction. Soft, measured. Ranger's ears twitched, head snapping toward the sound. He padded to the doorway, body low, muscles coiled. A shadow moved in the candlelight, just for a second, and was gone. Mason turned to Derek. "We move now. Derek, help Claire. Louise, keep Sophia between you and me." They retraced Ranger's path, this time with the women in the middle. Ranger stayed ahead, pausing at each turn, scanning the dark before leading them on. They reached a sloping corridor that smelled faintly of open air. Relief hovered just ahead, until a sharp clang echoed behind them, the sound of metal hitting stone. A signal. Ranger broke into a run. The corridor bent sharply, ending at a low hatch partially hidden by brambles growing through a crack in the rock. Mason shoved it open, the cold night air rushing in like water through a broken dam. One by one they scrambled out into the forest. They didn't stop moving until they were deep among the trees. Only then did Mason risk a glance back. The hatch was already swallowed by darkness. He turned to Ranger, who stood watch at the edge of the small clearing, eyes still on the direction they'd come. Louise held Sophia close, murmuring words Mason couldn't hear. Claire leaned against a tree, catching her breath. Mason stepped toward Ranger and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "You found them," he said quietly. Ranger didn't move, but the steady weight of his gaze told Mason all he needed to know. In that moment, the line between soldier and stray disappeared. He wasn't just along for the mission, he was shaping it. And Mason knew that without him, Caleb Knox would still have 2 more prisoners in the dark, and they'd have nothing but questions. Now, at least, they had names and a target. The night was a cold weight on their shoulders. Every step away from the hatch felt both too slow and too loud. Ranger took point, ears twitching at every shift in the wind, his paws silent on the forest floor. Mason kept Sophia close to Louise and Claire between himself and Derek. The terrain dropped steep toward a dry creek bed, the moonlight fractured by a canopy of pine. They were halfway across when Ranger froze. His body stiffened into a statue, head low, eyes locked on a shadow up the slope. Mason caught the change instantly and dropped to a crouch, signaling the others down. The shadow shifted, a man in a dark parka stepping into the moonlight, a short rifle slung across his chest. His gaze swept the creek bed without seeing them. Not yet. Ranger moved before Mason could give the order. He ghosted up the slope in a low run, each stride precise, silent. The guard had just enough time to glance sideways before 200 pounds of muscle and instinct hit him square in the chest. They went down hard, the rifle clattering into the leaves. Ranger's teeth found the man's forearm before he could reach for a sidearm. A deep growl filled the air, vibrating in the bones. Mason was there in seconds, yanking the pistol from the guard's holster and twisting his other arm behind his back. Derek produced a nylon zip tie from his pocket, cinching the man's wrists tight. The guard's breath came in sharp bursts, eyes flicking from Mason to Ranger, who still stood over him, chest heaving, lips curled just enough to promise another strike if needed. Mason hauled the man to his knees. "Name." The guard shook his head, a smirk tugging at the edge of his mouth. "You think rescuing a couple of women changes anything? You're already too late." "Too late for what?" Mason pressed. The smirk widened, but his eyes were hard. "The transfer started hours ago. By dawn, they'll be ghosts. Same as the others." Luis's grip on Sophia tightened. "Where?" The guard looked straight at Mason. "You don't have the time or the reach. None of you do." Mason studied him for a beat, then shoved him toward Derek. "Hold him." He turned to Ranger, who was still watching the guard like he might finish what he started. "Good work, buddy," Mason murmured before scanning the tree line. They needed extraction, and fast. Moving on foot with 2 weakened survivors and a prisoner was asking to be caught. Mason led them to a narrow ridge marked by a gnarled cedar. He crouched at its base and brushed away a layer of pine needles, revealing a small, weathered metal case half buried in the soil. Inside was a compact, military-issue radio. Old, but Mason had stashed it here years ago as part of a training exercise no one else had taken seriously. He flicked it on. Static, then a faint tone. "Alpha 6, this is Ironhawk. Authenticate." Mason rattled off a code that hadn't left his memory. A pause, then, "Confirmed? State your need. Priority extract, 5 personnel plus 1 detainee. Sector Bravo 7 Sierra." "Copy. ETA 90 minutes to extraction zone." Mason closed the case and stood. "We've got a ride. Old sawmill site on the northeast ridge. Let's move." The path there was all uphill, every incline testing the women's strength and the men's patience. Ranger ranged ahead, scouting each bend before signaling them forward with a glance or a short pause. Twice, he stopped dead, ears up, before veering them onto side trails that avoided open ground. Mason didn't ask how he knew. He trusted the dog's instincts more than any satellite feed. They reached the sawmill clearing with 20 minutes to spare. The wide, frost-crusted ground was bordered by skeletal beams and rusted saw blades hanging like relics. Mason positioned them near the center, back to back, eyes on the perimeter. The prisoner sat against a beam, wrists bound, head tilted like he was listening for something. Mason crouched in front of him. "You've got a choice. Help us, or you ride out of here in silence." The guard laughed under his breath. "You don't get it. Caleb Knox isn't just moving people. He's moving the network. Tonight's the last night Rockford's even a dot on the map." Before Mason could push, the distant thump of rotor blades rolled over the ridge. The sound grew into a steady thunder, the downwash flattening grass and scattering loose snow. A matte black helicopter flared above the tree line and dropped into the clearing like it had grown from the ground. 2 medics spilled out, one heading for Sophia and Claire, the other taking the prisoner off Derek's hands. Ranger jumped into the cabin without hesitation, turning to watch the perimeter even from inside. Luis guided Sophia aboard, his hand never leaving hers. Claire followed, steady now but still pale. Mason scanned the trees one last time. No movement, no glint of glass, just the whisper of the pines and the cold air on his face. He climbed into the bird, the door sliding shut behind him. As the helicopter lifted, Ranger moved to sit beside him, the two of them watching the dark forest fall away below, a place that still held too many secrets, but tonight had given up a few. And with Knox's name now in the open, Mason knew they were only getting started. The tip came from Kendra Hale, her voice cutting through the secure line like a scalpel. "He's at a hunter's cabin north of the ridge, alone for now, but not for long. If you're going to move, it has to be now." They went light. No extra packs, no noise they didn't need. The snow here was patchy, the ground frozen enough to carry sound farther than comfort allowed. Ranger led them along a contour trail invisible to anyone without his nose, weaving between wind-fallen trees and low granite shelves. Twice he stopped dead, ears pivoting before changing their course to skirt a stretch of open ground. Through the tangle of spruce ahead, Mason caught sight of the cabin, timber walls grayed by weather, a chimney cold, the windows boarded save for one bent slat. He signaled Derek to circle left, Luis to hold with Sophia and Claire just inside the tree line. Ranger's gaze locked on movement behind the cabin, his body dropping into that lean, electric crouch. The figure appeared, a tall man in a hood, armed, sweeping the tree line with casual menace. He never saw the dog coming. Ranger launched from cover, hitting him at the hip and driving him down into the snow. The weapon skittered out of reach as Mason closed the distance, boot pinning the man's wrist while Derek hauled him upright and bound his hands. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and oil. Caleb Knox was already standing, hands loose at his sides, a faint, knowing smile cutting across his weathered face. "You've been busy," he said, voice calm as if they were old acquaintances meeting by chance. "Busy enough to end this," Mason replied. Caleb's eyes flicked toward Ranger, who stood in the doorway, chest rising slow, gaze fixed and unblinking. "Interesting choice of partner," he murmured. "That dog's led you somewhere, hasn't he? But you've only dug up one bone. There's a whole graveyard under Rockford." Mason stepped closer, cuffs ready. "Then you can explain it from a cell." As the steel closed around his wrists, Caleb leaned in just enough for Mason to hear. "Graveyards don't stay buried forever, and when the ground shifts, you'd better hope you're not standing on it." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boards on the cabin windows. Ranger kept his eyes on Caleb until the man was marched into the snow, the dog's presence as much a restraint as the cuffs. For Mason, the arrest was a victory, but Caleb's words stuck like a sliver, because men like him didn't bluff without reason. And Ranger, watching the tree line with ears forward, seemed to know the fight wasn't over. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through Rockford's town square, where a crowd had gathered under the early winter sun. Children clung to their parents' coats, old-timers stood shoulder to shoulder with off-duty deputies, and for the first time in years, the town felt whole. Ranger stood at Mason's side, his coat brushed until it gleamed, the silvered fur along his back rippling each time he shifted his weight. He wasn't tethered, didn't need to be. His eyes roved over the crowd, alert but calm, as if he knew this was his stage. Mayor Whitley stepped forward, his voice carrying over the murmur of voices. "We are here today to honor someone who cannot speak for himself, but who has spoken louder in his actions than most men do in a lifetime." He nodded toward Ranger. "This dog, this protector, kept us safe when shadows threatened to take our town." A young girl stepped out from the front row, holding a small velvet box. Inside was a silver collar, its plate engraved with the words, "Not a stray, an unnamed hero." When Mason took it, he felt the weight of it, not just the metal, but everything it represented. He crouched, letting Ranger sniff the box first. The dog's ears twitched, his eyes flicking up to meet Mason's. For a heartbeat, the crowd was silent, and then Mason slipped the collar over Ranger's head. The fit was perfect. Applause rolled through the square, but it wasn't the polite kind. It was raw, relieved, the kind of sound people make when fear has finally loosened its grip. Ranger didn't flinch. He simply stood taller, scanning the faces like he was making sure every one of them was safe. In the midst of the clapping, Mason caught movement at the edge of the crowd. Kendra Hale, the former analyst who'd given them the tip on Caleb, lingered in the shadows. She gave the smallest nod, then turned away before he could speak to her. A reminder that while this was a victory, the game beneath Rockford wasn't over. Mayor Whitley raised a hand for quiet. "From this day forward, when you walk this square, remember, safety doesn't come from walls or cameras. It comes from those who act without asking for thanks." His gaze lingered on Ranger, and from those who don't even ask for a name. As the crowd began to disperse, children approached to stroke Ranger's fur. He allowed it, even leaned into one boy's touch, but his eyes never left the street beyond the square. Mason saw it too, the way Ranger's instincts never rested. The town might feel safe now, but Ranger knew better. And Mason realized, with a knot tightening in his chest, that the dog's job was far from done. The air in the clearing was still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The remnants of the old storage shed had been cleared away, leaving only the hard, packed earth where the underground room once trapped its victims. Now, a single hole had been dug in the center, dark soil waiting to cradle new roots. Mason stood with Sophia and a handful of others, survivors, townspeople, and a few deputies who had helped in the rescue. Ranger sat close, ears flicking at every small sound, his gaze fixed on the open ground like he understood what was about to happen. The apple sapling lay nearby, its thin branches trembling in the cold breeze. Mason took hold of the trunk, lowering it into the hole. For a moment there was silence. No speeches, no applause, just the sound of shovels biting into the earth as they covered the roots together. When the last mound of soil was patted down, Sophia stepped forward. In her hand was a strip of red cloth, frayed and faded. Mason recognized the careful way she held it, as though it might come apart if she breathed too hard. "This," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the stillness, "was from the blanket I had when I was a kid, the night they took me. This was all I managed to keep. I used to hold it in the dark to remind myself there was a world outside those walls." She handed it to Mason. "Tie it here. Let it be a promise no one will ever be hidden away again." Mason knelt at the base of the sapling, fingers tightening the cloth around the slender trunk. The red stood out against the brown bark, a flash of life against the muted winter colors. Ranger moved closer, pressing his nose to the ribbon, then sitting beside it like a silent guard. Out of the corner of his eye, Mason noticed a figure standing back among the trees, Caleb's younger brother, Evan. For months, Evan had avoided the town, ashamed of what his family had done. Now, without a word, he stepped forward and placed a small handful of apple seeds into the soil at the tree's base. "They were in my grandfather's shed," he said, voice rough. "I thought maybe we could grow more." No one spoke. It was an unplanned gesture, a quiet act that seemed to close a door on years of pain. As the group stepped back, sunlight broke through the clouds, landing squarely on the red cloth. Mason felt something loosen in his chest. The tree wasn't just a symbol. It was a marker, a line drawn between the darkness that had been and the light they'd chosen. Ranger stayed by the trunk, eyes scanning the horizon. Healing was happening here, but like the tree, it would need time and a watchful guardian to grow. Rockford had grown quieter since the rescue, but Mason felt its pulse in the small things. The way neighbors waved from porches, the laughter spilling from the diner, the scent of fresh wood smoke in the air. He'd made his choice. The city could wait. Ranger had found his place here, and so had he. That night, they sat by the fireplace in Mason's cabin. The logs popped and cracked, sending flickers of gold across Ranger's coat. Outside, the snow was softening, revealing patches of green beneath. Mason reached down, resting his hand on Ranger's neck. The dog leaned in, eyes half closed, as if the months of danger and darkness were finally giving way to peace. A knock came at the door. Sophia, holding a basket of apples from the new tree. She set them on the table, gave Ranger a gentle scratch behind the ear, and left without a word. Mason smiled. Some bonds didn't need conversation. He looked into the flames, then back at Ranger. "Guess we're staying, buddy." Ranger's tail thumped once, slow and sure. Before the night closed in, Mason glanced toward the camera set on his desk. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" he asked quietly, letting the question hang. If you believe in stories like Ranger's, share yours and help keep these tales alive by supporting our German Shepherd channel. There are more stories waiting, and some of them might just change a life.